What does this mean? I can hear those words as if I were hearing them still in my childhood confirmation classroom. What does this mean? We are to fear, love, and trust in God above all things. An almost robotic response. The words from Luther's small catechism have been emblazoned on the hearts and minds of Lutheran confirmation students everywhere. As surely, I imagine, as the Ten Commandments were first given to the Israelites many years ago. Newly brought out of slavery from the land of Egypt, God's chosen ones, the people of Israel, hear these new commandments read to them in the context of a covenant promise between God and Israel. A marker of national and religious identity already well established in the covenant with Abraham that we heard last week, but a moment that would nonetheless define their relationship with God from that point on. Now, these commandments are not exactly a set of laws or legal codes, but are intimately tied within the context of that covenant promise. And I think it's unfortunate that Luther's catechism misses what our Jewish siblings actually observe to be the first commandment. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. With that reading, the commandments begin with a word of good news. The law is rooted in gospel. And to make that point abundantly clear, the you in that passage is singular. These words are a reminder that God has liberated each individual person of Israel, that God has redeemed each one of us. And so, rooted first in God's action, the Ten Commandments are ultimately given as a model for living in community with God and with each other. As later summarized in the version that appears in Deuteronomy, the Ten Commandments essentially boil down to the familiar love God, love your neighbor. It's a vision of God's shalom, to borrow from Dr. Men's sermon last week. God's shalom or peace or wholeness. It's a vision of being in an intimate relationship with God and with one another. Fast forward to the time of Jesus, to the scene we encounter in John's gospel, and we get a vastly different picture. We encounter a religious practice not driven by love of God and neighbor for its own sake, but one that's been co-opted by a system made oppressive by corrupt temple practices by those in authority. In 3 out of 4 Gospels, we do get an idea of what that corruption looked like. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus accuses the money changers and vendors of making the temple into a den of robbers, exploiting people with price gouging and dishonest transactions. But in John, there's really no specific reason given. Jesus walks in, takes one look around, and promptly makes a whip to drive everyone out with the stern warning, take these things out of here. Instead of targeting individual practice, it seems Jesus condemns the whole system. And then, in an allusion to the passion events yet to unfold, Jesus makes the even bolder assertion, my body is the temple, the real place where you can meet God free of obstruction. Access to God is not comprised of complex rules and regulations and systems that have been corrupted and only exacerbates the problem. Access to God is here and now. God is made known in the very presence of Jesus in John, the Word made flesh who makes his dwelling among us. Here in Jesus is the place where we see God and humanity meet. Get these other things out of here. What you need is here. Or as if to say with Jesus, or as Jesus does elsewhere, I am. Now, while neither we as Christians nor our Jewish siblings today have any firsthand notion of temple-based worship in practice, we do know something of what it's like to get bogged down in things that distract or deter us from being in relationship with God. We who seek ordination and consecration in this church as pastors and deacons know something of what it's like to jump through hoop after hoop, feeling like so many times we're always having to prove our call to ministry. And that hoop jumping continues in the paperwork and interviews and evaluations of CPE, MIC, internship, assignments, first call. For those of us who are LGBTQIA+, or persons of color, or living with disabilities, proving ourselves is made all the more difficult by the systemic hurdles of homophobia and transphobia, sexism, racism, ableism. The list could go on. Or it's the stress of midterm exams and papers fast approaching, the hours spent preparing for qualifying exams and writing theses and dissertations, the time-consuming labor of sorting through CVs and preparing for faculty candidate interviews, the minutia of managing academic administration and accreditation and comprehensive campaigns. It's not difficult to get bogged down in these things and burned out in the midst of just carrying out our vocations, making us feel like our relationship with the one who called us here is somehow distant at best. Instead of temple vendors and cattle, sheep, doves, and money changers swarming all around, the demands of academic and administrative hoops to jump through absorb so much of our time. During this season of Lent, a traditional time for giving up, we are invited into disciplines and practices that are meant to foster a mindset of repentance, of turning around, refocusing, and reorienting. This particular season, I've found myself returning to Quaker writer and theologian Richard Foster, who has written one of my favorite pieces on the spiritual practice of simplicity. Foster offers some very practical marks of what that simplicity looks like. For instance, he says, buy things for their usefulness rather than their status. Develop a habit of giving things away. Learn to enjoy things without owning them. Develop a deeper appreciation for creation. Reject anything that breeds the oppression of others. I've come to value this practice of simplicity as Foster describes it, though of course these are things that are easier said than done. But simplicity as a practice is an intentional invitation to declutter and remove those things which distract or even harm us, and an invitation to refocus on that which is life-giving, to enter anew into the intimate relationship with our Creator, which they invite us to and so desperately want with us. When I took a class on preaching the Gospel of John this past semester, one of the questions we asked after hearing a colleague preach a sermon was, what is the image of abundant life in this text? John's Gospel is indeed one of abundance, beginning right away with Jesus' first miracle of turning water into wine and other signs like the feeding of the 5,000. There's explicit abundance in these stories. But there is abundance in more subtle places too. And so I think that Jesus' act of cleansing the temple is an act of practicing simplicity. a clearing away of distractions in order that we might experience God's presence without obstruction. There is abundance here, and it is abundance in simplicity. And while there is no allusion to the 10 Commandments in this gospel story, it shouldn't be lost on us that the gospel writer sets this event in the context of Passover, a festival with its roots in the Exodus from Egypt, the journey through the wilderness, the covenant at Sinai. Maybe it's pure speculation, and it probably is, but I'd like to imagine that maybe, just maybe, Jesus had this in mind, pointing his people back to the covenant, back to all those words which God spoke, beginning first with a reminder of their liberation and redemption. These texts offer us very much the same thing. Whatever baggage we carry with us into this space today and throughout our days that weighs us down, Jesus strips all that away and offers us the divine presence and promise in his very self. I remember hearing way back at my seminary sampler visit 5 years ago of LSTC's mission statement for the first time: to form visionary leaders to bear witness to the good news of Jesus Christ. In the midst of our work here, no matter what else weighs on us, distracts us, burdens us, gives us stress or anxiety, this proclamation of good news is what we are here to do as God's own redeemed people, loved beyond our wildest imagining.